On the night of April 14th, 1865, as laughter echoed through Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., a single gunshot cracked the fragile peace of a nation that had just survived 4 years of civil war. In an instant, hope turned to horror. The man who had held a broken country together, the steady, weary, compassionate Abraham Lincoln, slumped forward in his seat. Within hours he would be dead. But this was no simple murder. It was a conspiracy, carefully planned, politically charged, and fueled by rage, fear, and a desperate belief that killing one man could resurrect a dying cause. To understand how such a moment became possible, we must look beyond the theater balcony. We must look into the soul of a divided nation. The United States had just emerged from the American Civil War, a brutal conflict that tore families apart and left cities burned and fields soaked in blood. Only days earlier, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Court House. The streets of Washington were filled with celebration. Bells rang from church towers. Soldiers embraced. Fireworks lit the sky. Peace seemed real at last. Lincoln himself had spoken of forgiveness. He did not want vengeance upon the defeated South. He wanted reconciliation. He wanted the nation restored gently, carefully, humanely. In his second inaugural address, he had called for malice toward none, with charity for all. Those words still lingered in the air of a country desperate to heal. Yet even as the nation celebrated survival, a darker plan was unfolding in the shadows, a plan born not from peace, but from fury, a plan that would transform triumph into tragedy and leave a wound in American history that would never fully close. The American Civil War had lasted 4 long years, from 1861 to 1865. It was not merely a conflict of armies. It was a battle over the identity of the nation itself. At its heart stood the question of slavery, and whether the United States would remain one unified country or fracture into separate sovereignties. Abraham Lincoln had carried the burden of leadership through unimaginable turmoil. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation, shifting the moral center of the war and declaring freedom for enslaved people in Confederate territories. He endured battlefield losses, political opposition, and personal grief. Yet he remained steadfast in his belief that the Union must survive. By April 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Its armies were exhausted. Supplies were scarce. Morale was broken. When Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant, it signaled the effective end of the rebellion. Though smaller skirmishes remained, the great conflict had been decided. Washington rejoiced. Crowds filled the avenues. Bands played patriotic songs. Strangers embraced as though reunited after a long exile. It was a rare moment of shared relief after years of sorrow. Lincoln allowed himself a rare evening of relaxation. He accepted an invitation to attend a comedy performance at Ford's Theater. The play was light-hearted. The mood was celebratory. Few could imagine that beneath the laughter lurked hatred sharp enough to strike at the very heart of the government. For while Lincoln envisioned rebuilding the South with compassion, there were those who saw his victory as tyranny. They believed he had destroyed their way of life. Among them stood a man whose fame masked his fanaticism. John Wilkes Booth was not an obscure radical. He was a celebrated actor from a famous theatrical family. Handsome, charismatic, and admired on stage, he moved easily among audiences who applauded his performances. Yet behind his charm burned an intense loyalty to the Confederate cause. Booth despised Abraham Lincoln. He viewed him not as a unifier but as a dictator. The Emancipation Proclamation, in his eyes, was not justice, but betrayal. As the Confederacy weakened, Booth's frustration deepened into obsession. Originally, Booth had plotted to kidnap Lincoln. His plan was to capture the president and exchange him for Confederate prisoners of war. He gathered associates who shared his sympathies: Lewis Powell, David Herold, George Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt. Meetings were held. Weapons were discussed. Escape routes were considered. But when the Confederacy fell, kidnapping no longer seemed enough. Booth became convinced that only a dramatic act could avenge the South. The plan escalated. They would strike multiple targets at once. The president would be killed at Ford's Theater. Vice President Andrew Johnson would be assassinated. Secretary of State William H. Seward would be eliminated. The goal was chaos. If the Union government could be thrown into confusion, perhaps the South could regain leverage. Perhaps fear would replace celebration. It was a desperate gamble rooted in ideology and illusion. Booth believed he was acting heroically. He believed history would remember him as a liberator. Instead, he stepped onto a path that would brand his name with infamy forever. On April 14, 1865, Booth learned that Lincoln would attend the evening performance of Our American Cousin. Familiar with the theater's layout, Booth prepared carefully. He knew when the audience would laugh. He knew when sound would mask the crack of a pistol. At approximately 10:15 p.m., Booth entered the presidential box. The audience erupted in laughter at a well-timed line from the stage. In that instant, Booth fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. Major Henry Rathbone attempted to seize him, but Booth slashed Rathbone with a knife and leapt to the stage. Though he fractured his leg in the fall, he stood and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis! Thus always to tyrants!" The crowd was stunned. Some thought it part of the play. Others screamed as the truth became horrifyingly clear. Booth fled through the backstage area and disappeared into the night. Across the city, Lewis Powell forced entry into the home of William H. Seward, who was bedridden from an earlier accident. Powell stabbed Seward and members of his household. Though gravely injured, Seward survived. George Atzerodt, assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, lost his courage and failed to act. The conspiracy had partially succeeded. The president lay dying. Lincoln was carried to the Peterson house across the street. Doctors worked through the night. He never regained consciousness. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton spoke softly. Now he belongs to the ages. Booth fled with David Herold into Maryland and then Virginia. For 12 days, federal troops pursued them relentlessly. The nation demanded justice. On April 26th, soldiers quartered them in a tobacco barn on Richard Garrett's farm. Herold surrendered. Booth refused. The barn was set ablaze. Amid rising flames, Booth was shot by Sergeant Boston Corbett. Paralyzed and in agony, he whispered reportedly, "Useless, useless." He died hours later. 8 conspirators were tried before a military tribunal. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Herold, and George Atzerodt were sentenced to death and hanged on July 7, 1865. Others received prison terms, including Dr. Samuel Mudd, who had treated Booth's broken leg. The assassination altered the course of Reconstruction. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, lacking Lincoln's political skill and unifying presence. The era that followed was marked by tension, resistance, and struggle over civil rights and national healing. Booth believed violence would revive a defeated cause. Instead, it hardened divisions and reshaped the nation's future. Lincoln's funeral train traveled through cities and towns, crowds lining the tracks in grief. Formerly enslaved Americans mourned deeply. Many believed they had lost their greatest protector. The conspiracy had aimed to silence a leader of reconciliation. Instead, it immortalized him. The shot fired in Ford's Theater did more than end a life. It transformed a president into a symbol. It reminded a nation that democracy is fragile, that hatred can erupt even in moments of triumph, and that the loss of wise leadership can alter history's course. Yet Lincoln's ideals endured. His call for unity, justice, and compassion survived the bullet meant to destroy them, and in that endurance lies the final lesson of the Lincoln conspiracy. Violence may echo loudly in the moment, but principles rooted in humanity echo longer through time.